Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's tutorial, I am going to be giving you some tips and tricks to working with epoxy. And these are just things that I have learned over the past year of working with epoxy that would have been very helpful had I known them when I first started. First, I'd like to say, please do your research before jumping into working with epoxy. There are very many people who develop a allergy to working with epoxy resin. It can go from mild to severe. I personally do have an allergy to epoxy resin. I take safety precautions that work for myself. Please do not go off of what I am doing in this video. What I'm doing works for me. Does not mean it'll work for you. Working with epoxy resin can be very dangerous if it is not used properly. So please research, do your research, look up every safety measure that you can take. Wear gloves all the time. Some people need to wear respirators. Please work with it in a well-ventilated area. I use an air purifier. I do not have it on right now for the sake of this video, and I'm mixing a very small batch, which can still give me a reaction. I'm hoping I could get through this video pretty quickly so that I don't. But I have an air purifier in my craft room. I keep the door closed. I work right by a window that has a double fan that blows air out to move the bad air out. I have the air purifier has carbon filters that help with fumes. So this has been working for me lately. The reaction I get is a rash, so a skin rash. So what I'm doing is what works for me. Please look into it before you work with the resin. That is my warning to you guys. Okay, so if you guys have tried out my previous videos working with resin, some of you may have had some issues with air bubbles in your epoxy. Now, I started off making tumblers, and tumblers can be very frustrating to create when you are working with epoxy and you don't mix it right, or you get air bubbles in the epoxy resin. I will try and zoom in so you can see. I've already poured both parts, part A and part B. Most resins, from what I know, are a 1-to-1 ratio. So you're gonna pour equal amounts. I use these little medicine cups that I buy in bulk online. And I don't know if you guys can see this on camera. I'll try to zoom in. But when you pour it, there's bubbles in it. Now, when you pour them into each other to mix them, it creates more bubbles. If you don't do something to get rid of those bubbles, when it hardens and cures, those bubbles will still be there. So here are some tools that I've purchased over the past year working with resin that have helped minimize the air bubbles. Now, when you create things working with resin, everything's handmade. Obviously, there will still be some imperfections. It's handmade, it's not machine made. So keep that in mind. This isn't going to fix it 100%, but it will reduce the number of air bubbles that you get. So the first thing that I like to do after I pour both part A and B, one of the parts, part A, I believe, is thicker than part B. So after I pour them into my medicine cups, I put them on this mug warmer. Now what this is just a small plate that I purchased on Amazon. And it has a little switch right here to turn it on and off. And what it does is it's basically a hot plate. So it's going to warm the epoxy. Now what warming it does is it pops the air bubbles. So I like to leave the thicker part, which is part A, on it longer than part B. The thinner part usually doesn't have very many air bubbles, and you don't want to heat both parts too long because when you go to stir them, it'll give a reaction and it will cure like instantly, and smoke and just, it's scary. And it's happened to me one time. Actually, I think it was when I was trying to record last time. So let's not do that again. I only let the thin one heat for a little bit, like I said. The thicker part I let get very thin. It almost turns into like a water-like consistency, and then I'll take it off the mug warmer and let it cool down for a bit before I pour it into the thinner part and then stir them together. Now, you always want to wear gloves, and you could buy these, like I said, in bulk. They help me make sure that I'm measuring equal parts of both part A and part B of my epoxy. I poured it off camera because I purchased the epoxy in big gallons and I didn't want to look awkward on camera trying to hold the gallon and pour it in. Another thing that you're going to want to look into if you decide to work with resin long term are these silicone mats. This helps keep your workplace, your workspace clean. And if the epoxy does spill onto the mat, you could pop it right off as opposed to it falling on your desk and it staying stuck there. It will cure onto any surface and it won't come off. So silicone mats are a must. Another thing that is very handy to have around is a heat gun. I purchased this at Joann's. This is great for tumbler making. When a tumbler is spinning, you push the button. It's basically like a hair dryer. It blows hot air and it'll help pop any air bubbles. It'll help get your epoxy flowing more. If you're using inks or paints that you want to blend into each other, this is a must. And I believe I only paid like $10 with the coupon at Joann's. A torch is great for popping bubbles. Great for popping bubbles. This one I purchased on Amazon. You can adjust the flame level, and that is what it looks like. You want to be very careful though when using these because you can set epoxy on fire and burn epoxy. So you want, when you are using it to torch the epoxy, you want to lightly and quickly go over the area you're trying to pop the bubbles on. And my last tip, here's the thin part. There's already no bubbles, so I'm going to take that off and put it to the side. I like to shake it a little just to mix it up, and then I leave it on for a little bit longer. Another tip that I have is the wider popsicle sticks. Now, I've tried silicone stir sticks, I've tried metal stir sticks, I've tried every type of stir stick, and the one that I get the least amount of air bubbles in with using is this wider one. Some of the smaller kits of epoxy that you could buy at Michael's or Hobby Lobby come with these smaller stir sticks, and I've noticed when I use these, it creates so many bubbles even if I heat the epoxy. There will be a ton of bubbles in my epoxy after, so these create the least amount for me. If you don't have any problems using these, then be my guest, but the thicker ones are a must for me. And like I said, you don't want to let it heat for too long because when you mix them, it'll cure. Like, it'll get rock hard, it'll smoke, it'll smell awful. You will think you're dying if you inhale it, so please don't do it. Let it cool down. Another thing that you can do if you don't have one of these, this was actually only like $8 on Amazon, the mug warmer. If you don't have a mug warmer, you can get, give me 1 second. You can get one of these plastic cups or any cup and fill it with fairly warm water, like pretty warm water. And what you do is you pour part A into part B or however, and fill the cup up with warm water, and then place your cup with both parts into it without getting water into the actual cup with epoxy, and then stir it like that. And the heat from the warm water will help to pop the bubbles also that are in the resin. So that's a good option if you don't have a mug warmer. That's what I did prior to getting one of these. This is just easier for me because as I'm setting up my projects, I could just have it on the mug warmer and I could put a few cups at a time, as opposed to having to sit there and hold it and make sure it doesn't fall in the water. Because if you get epoxy in the water, it'll ruin it. Sorry if I seem like I'm out of breath. It's because I am. I have health issues and my lungs haven't been too great today. Okay, so there's like 1 or 2 bubbles in here, but it's fine. Let me show you the difference. I don't know if you guys can see that or if it's blurry, but it's pretty clear. Now I'm gonna let that cool for a bit. I'm gonna shut off my mug press. If you buy one of these, please do not forget to shut it off because it can be dangerous. So we're gonna let them cool for a bit before we mix them. Let me see. I need to make some keychains, but they are Christmas gifts, so I don't want to put them in the video because they have photos on them. I don't want to put them on the video and ruin the gift. So let me get my mold that I've been working on. I got another coffin. Okay. So that's what we'll use this epoxy that I've mixed for, and then I'll work on the keychains off camera. I'm gonna pour the thinner one, which has been cooling longer, into the thicker one. And what you wanna do is you wanna stir slowly. And you wanna try to not lift the popsicle stick because that'll create more air bubbles or let more air in. You want to make sure you get around the sides of the cup to scoop out any that may be there. You want to make sure you mix this very well, because if you don't mix the epoxy correctly, it'll stay tacky. It won't cure and harden the way it's supposed to. It'll feel sticky after, and that's how you know that you didn't epoxy correct or mix it correctly. And on tumblers, there will be soft spots. It's never happened to me, knock on wood, but I've heard stories and seen photos in like craft groups of the tumbler being very sticky, and most people say that it's from not mixing properly or not measuring out your epoxy properly. So you want to mix it until it's clear. You want to scrape what's on the stick as well. Continue stirring. When you're working with molds, you do not want to use your torch to pop bubbles. I made the mistake of doing that when I used the coffin mold in my last video. And what that does is when you heat your silicone, because the molds are made out of silicone so that the epoxy doesn't stick to it and it pops right out. When you use a torch, it gives too much heat, and what it does is it melts the epoxy to the silicone. So when you try and demold it, it doesn't demold. It ruins your mold and it cures to it. So we won't be doing that again. Okay, now there's a ton of like micro bubbles. So I'm going to show you what it looks like and how we're going to try to get rid of those. I don't want to pour it out, but you can see that right there. So you're going to let it sit for a bit. And the bigger bubbles will rise to the top, and we'll use the torch for that. I forgot to mention, 91% alcohol comes in very, very handy. I put some into a spray bottle like this, and that's what helps me pop bubbles when I'm using my molds. So we're going to pour it into our mold, and then we'll spray it with the alcohol, and it helps pop the bubbles. You don't want to spray too much though. Okay, some of the bubbles have already come to the top, and you're just gonna very quickly, very lightly torch it. And it pops them. Okay. After you pour it, you want to let it set for a while. I need to put some more. You guys, if I would not edit my videos, you guys would know that I'm a fool, like 90% of the time. Only a couple sprays should do the job. So those are my tips and tricks for epoxy. I plan on making a few more videos with epoxy to show you guys different things that you can make. The possibilities are endless with epoxy. You can make tumblers, you can make keychains, you can make these little coffins. They sell so many different molds on Amazon, and there are a bunch of different pages on Facebook that I've come across that are specifically just shops that sell molds. Also, one more thing, if you are making molds or keychains, the epoxy resin that I used in my previous video that came in the little box that you can find at Michael's or Hobby Lobby, the Amazing Clear Cast, I believe it's called, Alumilite, that one will yellow. You want to look into and read up on the different types of epoxies. You want to make sure it is a clear epoxy resin, because some will dry white. They're casting resins. You don't want those. You want to make sure it's clear epoxy resin. If you live in an area that is known to be hot, you want to make sure that the epoxy resin has a high heat resistance temperature. You want to make sure that it has a UV resistance because it will turn yellow, especially on white cups. I learned that the hard way when I first started out. I was only buying my epoxy resin from Michael's, and it was the Amazing Clear Cast, and my white cups developed a beige and yellow tint to them. So you want to make sure that you read up. There's a bunch of different things to know about epoxy. This video, I hope, was helpful with trying to help you guys get rid of the micro air bubbles that can sometimes pop up in your epoxy. So thanks again for watching. If you guys have any questions, comment down below. If I don't get back to you right away, you guys can always shoot me an email or a message. I am on Facebook and I am on Instagram under Bradford Customized Creations. Thanks so much for watching.